Gail Edwards. Gail Edwards is our Department Chair of History. She's also a bibliographer of the scholarly journal BC Studies. In May 2010, Picturing Canada, a history of Canadian children's illustrated books and publishing, which she co-authored, was published by the University of Toronto Press. Her current research interests include the history of print culture in British Columbia and the history of children's library services in Western Canada, and of course, Sir James Douglas. Please join me in welcoming Gail.
Thank you, Scott. So our story, like any good story, begins with a backstory. The world of 18th century, the Pacific Rim, as Britain was looking for the Northwest Passage that would speed the connection between Britain and Asia. They had been trying for centuries, and the idea was, instead of sailing west from Britain, this time they would try sailing east. So James Cook set sail in 1776 on his third voyage of exploration. He reached the northwest coast in March of 1778 at about 44 degrees, roughly San Francisco. He then sailed north, anchored near Nootka on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and discovered, much to his surprise, that the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples were already familiar with European trade goods. They had been trading with the Russians who were to the north of them, and trade goods had filtered up from Spanish California. He was welcomed in a ceremony. He explored as far north as 70 degrees, and on the return voyage, his ship mates discovered that the pelts of sea otter that they had purchased for approximately $1 a skin sold for 90 pounds each in Canton, about an 1,800% profit. The ship arrived home in 1780 with news about the resources in the Pacific Northwest, and that saw the rush for sea otter pelts that stretches from 1785 through 1825. And there's an engraving of a sea otter from the published voyages of Cook. In 1792, George Vancouver, who had been on Cook's voyages of exploration, arrived. He mapped the coastline from about 30 degrees south to 60 degrees north, from roughly Baja, California to slightly north of present-day Prince Rupert. He mapped Burrard Inlet and encountered 2 Spanish ships sailing and mapping in the area at Spanish Banks. He also noted roughly the outline of the inside coast, part of the inside coast of Vancouver Island, and suggesting that there were good resources. On that trip, he also discovered that contact had brought change. Between Cook's voyage and Vancouver's arrival, smallpox had swept the area, and Vancouver found many depopulated villages and evidence that, in fact, there was rapid change happening on the northwest coast. And in fact, there was rapid change throughout North America, resulting from increased competition between the major powers. Between 1763 and 1820, one of the main fights for economic control was happening between the Hudson's Bay Company, which had been given a charter in 1670 by the British Crown, and a fur trade company centered in Montreal, the Northwest Company that had grown out of the old French fur trade. The Hudson's Bay Company was interested in making profit for its stock in England. The Northwest Company, which was a relationship of family, by blood, by marriage, by extension, were interested in making profits for the stockholders in Montreal. And the 2 companies were direct rivals. They were also looking for new resources to exploit. So in 1792, one of the Northwest Company partners, Alexander Mackenzie, traveled overland, spent the winter in the Peace River area, and reached the Pacific coast at the mouth of the Bella Coola River on Bentic Arm, July 22nd, 1793, missing George Vancouver, who was sailing up the coast by a matter of weeks, had they but known that each other were there. American competition was also heating up. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase meant that the United States had control of an area extending from Mississippi through to the Rockies. And Lewis and Clark, who were commissioned for their voyage of discovery, arrived in 1805 at the mouth of the Columbia River. About the same time that Simon Fraser was given charge of the Northwest Company operations west of the Rockies and instructed to trace the Columbia River to its mouth. He set up headquarters at Fort St. James, established Fort George at the confluence of the Fraser and the Chaco rivers, and in 1808 he traveled down a river that he thought was the Columbia, but it turned out that the mouth was too far north. He had discovered the Fraser, or he had been shown the Fraser River by the indigenous peoples of the area. The canyon was too rough for practical transportation of furs, so a third attempt was made by the Northwest Company with David Thompson looking for the Columbia. In 1807, he reached the headwaters of the river, didn't get to the mouth until July of 1811, where he was disappointed to find that this man, John Jacob Astor, had set up a fur trading post with the help of Northwest Company employees. The Pacific Fur Company arrived roughly at the same time as Thompson, and the Northwest Coast suddenly saw an amazing rivalry of ships arriving stocked with goods, with competition and a period of increased violence as new material objects brought new trading relationships, but also destabilizing the area further. So there's Fraser's route and Thompson's route. So into this very complex situation arrives James Douglas. Douglas was born in 1803 in Demerara in British Guiana. His father, John Douglas, had mercantile interests in Glasgow and a firm with his two brothers. They were well connected and had an active trade route between North America and Britain, focusing primarily on sugar and cotton, which were grown in Guyana with the help of the slave population, and then the goods, the raw materials sent back to Glasgow. Douglas's mother, Martha Ritchie, was a free woman of color from Barbados, whose mother, Rebecca Ritchie, was a woman of property and herself a slave owner. James had an older brother, Alexander, and a younger sister, Cecilia. And in 1809, when John Douglas was in Glasgow, he married for a second time, this time legally, to a European woman in the Presbyterian Church, which meant that Douglas had a whole other set of family in Scotland. And as was quite typical for the time, his father moved back and forth between the colonial world of resource exploitation and his wife in the New World and the world of Scotland and his officially recognized wife. However, in 1812, John took his two sons to Scotland, where they were educated at the Lanark Grammar School. And in 1819, both Alexander and James came to British North America to enter the employ of the Northwest Company as apprentices. The Northwest Company, centered in Montreal, as I said, was a extended set of family relationships, trading partners out in the country, the partners in Montreal with headquarters in Montreal and fur storage at Lachine, just west of downtown, present-day present-day downtown. So in 1820, Douglas, who had spent the winter at Fort William, the major transportation point between Montreal and the Northwest Company's trading post to the west. So he would have gone from Montreal to Fort William by canoe, spent the winter learning the trade, spent the winter polishing his bookkeeping skills, and in the spring of 1820 was transferred to Île-à-la-Crosse on the north of the North Saskatchewan, just below the Churchill River. And that area was critical for the rivalry that was at its height between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. The chief trader at Île-à-la-Crosse was a man named William Connolly. So we know something about life at Fort William, the major point of exchange of goods. People were coming in and out. This would be sort of like setting up your office in a SkyTrain station. Furs came west to east, goods came east to west. Everybody met, exchanged, and then furs went back to Montreal, goods went out into the hinterland. Île-à-la-Crosse was one of those small posts where the indigenous peoples of the area met with the European traders. European traders married indigenous women. Their children entered the fur trade. So this is a place that's, at one and the same time, Scottish, Cree, Métis, highly complex. If you wanted to enter the fur trade, you had to learn to speak pretty good French. You needed local knowledge, and intermarriage with local communities brought that kind of trade knowledge. So wintering partners lived year-round. They traded. The Montreal partners marketed the furs and arranged provisions. The War of 1812 had interrupted supply lines, and staffing became increasingly difficult, and that period of late rivalry was impossible to sustain. And in 1821, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged to become a single fur trading monopoly. At Île-à-la-Crosse, Douglas was working under the supervision of this man, William Connolly. Connolly was one of those products of complex relationships. He had been born in Lachine around 1786. He'd been apprenticed at the age of 15 to the Northwest Company. In 1803, he married a Swampy Cree woman, Mionipi, known as Suzanne, according to the customs of the country. They were married in their own eyes, in the eyes of the community, and Connolly would have been incorporated into the extended trading relationships of his new wife's family.